but I can't wait to hear. So I want to thank everyone for coming out on a Sunday in June on a full moon to come and see. There he is, Brother Peter Moon. Give him a big hand. All right, so
thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. I'm going to pass around a couple of my recent newsletters. I have a subscription newsletter, and I'm going to pass around. I hope I have enough copies for everybody. I got the yellow one, which is recent, and the gold one, which is a little older. But try and make sure everybody gets at least one newsletter. Yes, I'll start passing these around. Okay, great. Give me one. Yeah, that's a good idea. Take that. All right. Okay, so as he said, as Greg said, my name is Peter Moon, and I've been writing for about 18 years. And 18 years ago, I got my license to begin as a writer when I discovered something called the Montauk Project, which was a story which we can call an urban legend, that was being generated by Preston Nichols, a scientist who had been involved in secret experiments on the eastern end of Long Island at Montauk Point. And he had incredible stories of mind control and experimentation with psychic energies that was parlayed into manipulation of time itself. These experiments are very exotic, they're very esoteric, and as they say, they remain an urban legend. However, there are substantial tentacles to what happened to establish that a Montauk project of some form did take place during the 70s and early 80s. And as I begin, I could spend a whole long time talking about the details of the Montauk project, where it led, how it led, because we're dealing with actually manipulating time and space and stories of time travel, which are quite fantastic. And I'm not going to linger on these subjects today, but that book catapulted me from an unknown person to instant recognition on what you would call the conspiracy circuit that was quite large in the early 90s. And as I began to I'm going to explain how the discovery and learning about time travel led me to connections with the indigenous Moorish or African community. Because when I began to try and study the Montauk Project to see if it actually took place, I discovered that the data trail was all shredded, because of course we're dealing with top military intelligence region. But what I did find, I began to have incredible experiences of synchronicity or coincidence. And coincidence is a phenomena of two things. When you get into the quantum realm, quantum meaning the underpinning of the physical plane, physical matter. When you get into the quantum realm, you begin to experience synchronicity. There was a scientist named Wolfgang Pauli who discovered the initial theories of quantum mechanics. And he was known to have weird coincidences happen around him that were called the Pauli effect. He teamed with a man named Carl Jung, who was a famous psychologist who rivaled and was sort of the antagonist of Sigmund Freud. And Carl Jung was very much into the occult and metaphysics. And he was a counselor of Wolfgang Pauli, and they worked together. And Jung points out the second important facet of synchronicity. As they say, it occurs when you begin to get into the quantum realm or penetrate the quantum realm of consciousness. Jung said that synchronicity, and he's the one that coined the word in the English language, which does still not appear in the dictionary. Carl Jung said, even though he was German, and he spoke English, he said that synchronicity was a poor substitute for what happened, as a word, as a poor substitute But what happens when you encounter the Tao? The T-A-O, or the Chinese sometimes spell it D-A-O, but it's pronounced Tao, which is the eternal way of the universe. I will get back to the Tao later on in the talk, but as you penetrate the eternal mystery of the universe, which is Chinese called the Tao, well, it's obviously related to quantum mechanics, and I began to penetrate this through research of an alleged time travel project. Now, what happened is I began to have many coincidences with certain occult realms, and one of the occult realms was the names Wilson and Cameron, who are very notorious occult families, although they're not famous to any significant extent, save for a man who was the head of the American Psychiatric Association during the 50s, Ewan Cameron. He was known as a butcher of people. He would, do lobotomies. He would shock people. He was a vicious, vicious man. And he was later recognized for doing these things. And an out-of-court settlement was made with a institute in Canada, the Allen Memorial Institute, where he worked out of with victims. But it was all done in Canada. It was done, the CIA had their MK Ultra experiments where they were mind controlling people. Now it just so happens that one of the most, effective psychics in the Montauk Project was a guy named Duncan Cameron, who was, I guess his father was the cousin of Ewan Cameron. So there was this very sinister mind control connection between the Camerons and the Montauk Project and mind control. Now, I found out many synchronicities with this name Cameron, which eventually led me to a meeting with a very remarkable woman named Marjorie Cameron, who was part of a magical experiment that was conducted with her, a man you've heard of named L. Ron Hubbard, who was to be the future founder of Scientology, and Jack Parsons, who was a rocket scientist who helped found the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, and he also devised the method by which we have the solid fuel rocket. Jack Parsons is most responsible for getting us to the moon and the space program, because he developed the solid fuel rocket, which means you're using asphalt, which is a slow burn, as opposed to a fast burn. And as you get a long, slow, sustained burn, you can sort of take off as a rocket and get up and penetrate the atmosphere. So Jack Parsons was also an occultist. Now, because I was tracing occult synchronicities, I happened to, when I released my first book, The Montauk Project, I went to the book fair in Anaheim, California, where I was, by mysterious circumstances, led to a man who would introduce me to Marjorie Cameron on that trip, and I would meet her. And she was a very pivotal person in my research, because when I discovered her, I said, why did I follow this occult trail to meet you? And I told her about all my synchronicities with the name Wilson and Cameron, and she said, well, although my name is Cameron, I'm really a Wilson. My father was really a Wilson, and I was adopted and raised by my uncle, who was a Cameron. They just called me Cameron. They would call me that in the Navy, that my name stuck. It's basically known as Cameron. And she says, I became in this experiment, they wanted to incarnate the goddess Babylon. And she was a representative of the feminine energy. And what they were trying to do in this occult experiment, which most people equate to devil worship, was to reintroduce the feminine current into this culture, which Jack Parsons had believed that the Catholic Church and other such institutions were abusing their power through patriarchy. So he was trying to do this magical experiment which would bring back the goddess Babylon, who was not viewed in the biblical sense, but viewed as somebody who would bring back the feminine current and balance the energies of the earth in what we now call this New Age phenomenon. So, by circumstance, if not coincidence, in the 1970s, I worked for L. Ron Hubbard. When I was 19, I graduated high school, I got involved with a local Scientology center in Davis, California, which was primarily a university town, and I had wonderful experiences in Scientology at that particular time, which was structured and run much differently than it is today. And in that center in Davis, I was learning about metaphysics, but I had been primarily interested in sports up to that time in my life. And I don't only had intellectualism forced on me in living in a university town and going to school with intelligent people. And I had a good mind, so that I had to take a learning step to actually improve my intellect. And then I got involved in spiritual matters, mostly through science fiction. But I still thought I was just like a meathead, you know, somebody walking around in a body. Because that's kind of what you're growing up to expect to be, at least in the, you know, Southern California culture where I grew up. So in Scientology, I began to learn that I was a spirit, and I actually had the phenomena of what they now call an out-of-body experience. Back then, and they still do, they call it exteriorization, where you're going outside of your body. And that was a very wonderful experience where I was actually able to lift over my head and look down. And that set me on a course that this told me that the procedures of Scientology really worked, because I've been practicing them to relieve, I guess what you call psychosomatic ills, headaches, sore throats that were psychosomatic in nature, and I had great results with this stuff. And I would help others with this as well. So I joined their most elite organization, which was called the Sea Organization, and I did not expect this. I did not request this. But after being in that organization for about a month, which was a very, I guess what you'd call, tough organization. It was like sort of like a spiritual boot camp, because you were occupied most of the time or you were studying. And it was meant to be tough. And after being in there about a month, and I thought I was performing very horribly, and I could substantiate that for you if we had time for the detail. I was not doing that well, but because I had, I guess, good test scores and whatnot, and didn't have a criminal background and a heavy drug background, they decided to send me to their elite ship, which is where L. Ron Hubbard was, and it was called the Apollo. And this is very interesting because they don't tell you where the ship is. You can kind of assume it's in the Mediterranean because you've read news stories where he's coasting around the Mediterranean. So I'm flown over with instructions to report to Madrid, Spain, at a certain address, and I met at the airport where I spend the night, and they say, do you know, guess where you're going? I said, I have no idea. The Mediterranean, they say, no, you're going to Morocco. You're going to Casablanca. And Morocco would of course later play into my connection to Africa, because I'm going to, you know, what is it, Casablanca, and you're not, obviously Casablanca is a completely different culture to anything we experience here, with women wearing their veils, and it's rather, you know, you're told not to look conspicuous, you're wearing Western clothes, don't stand out, don't make trouble, just shut up and, you know, get to the ship. And it did not look like a safe place to be, certainly, as you go through on the bus. But I arrived at the ship, and that becomes a career for me. And of course, eventually working for L. Ron Hubbard in his office. And of course, the interesting thing about L. Ron Hubbard was that he had devised this procedures which was called technology to free the human spirit. Now, of course, if you have something that is purported to be is either as good or is purported to be as good, you're going to have a lot of what I would call mysterious spiritual forces, which we can call jinn, that are there to stop you from getting that. So you had a lot of creepy, crawly people that were there trying to stop you or stop others from doing what we all might consider to be the right thing. So it was constantly being tested. And of course, he had an infrastructure around him, so he didn't have to put up with this stuff. At the same time, when I'd been there a few months, he was devising, he had a procedure of interrogation, which would make all of this waterboarding completely nonsensical, because you could use what they call an e-meter, which is a biofeedback device to determine if somebody's lying or even determine where somebody is. You can find, even if they're not telling you the truth, you can use this. And he had worked out a way so that the Moroccan security force could scrutinize people that were coming to work for the government. What L. Ron Hubbard and his people did not know that the head of the Moroccan security force, whose name was Colonel Alf Kjord, was trying to take over the government. He had a plot to assassinate the King of Morocco. And the King of Morocco, King Hassan II, he was in an airplane, and these two jet fighters from his own air force tried to shoot him down. And they penetrated the plane, and he went down. He just ducked it. He says, tell the pilot the king is dead. And the pilot radioed to the jet fighter, said, the king is dead, don't worry, you got it. Just let me land. So they said, okay. The king had fooled them. And when the king landed, he had this Colonel Alf Kjord arrested and murdered. You know, Colonel Alf Kjord was not a good guy. And the Church of Scientology, it had a different corporate name. They weren't known as the Scientologists. Were in bed with Colonel Alf Kjord. They did not want to kill the king, but they became a pariah when everything was discovered, and they had to get the hell out of Morocco. And it was very exciting times. I was very new to the organization at this point. And as coincidence would have it, and I was telling Greg, we have a planetary healing group that meets once a month in Oceanside, and the girl where her house is held, she happens to have a roommate who was Colonel Alf Kjord's secretary. She was I said, oh, I was in Morocco. She's Moroccan. And she says, oh, I was arrested. I remember that. I remember the Scientologists. So she's become a friend of mine and has invited me over to Morocco, which I'd love to go. I just don't know how I would swing it. But as I went to Morocco, and the only places I ever went in Morocco were Casablanca and Tangier, which is to the north across the Straits of Gibraltar. And I always thought, why am I going to Morocco? What's the significance here? And I only went off on, a Liberty Day, which you would take, only one day in Tangier. I went to a place called Robinson's Beach off Tangier, and as we're going to find some waves to body surf in, as on the way there, it's about 40 minutes outside of town, you're taking a taxi, and as the taxi would wheel its way on this road, you'd see these people walking with all their worldly possessions. And I said, who are these people? They're not the Arabs. Their skin was white, they were Caucasian. I said, who are these people? One lady reminded me of the Virgin Mary. She was on a donkey. They were kind of a cute people. But I said, who the hell are they? I've never heard of these people. And they would later play into my Synchronicities in this new book I just released, Montauk of the Living. They were the Berber people. And although my name is Peter Moon, and you know me as Peter Moon, it's a pen name I've adopted and I use. My real name, which was my given name, was Vince Barbaric, which came from Berberish, which my parents never knew this or told me this, but it comes from the Berber people. So, as I would learn, I might have more African heritage than a lot of black people who aren't even from Africa. They might be from America, you see? So, it gave me but I wouldn't find this out for years. Because my mother was Celtic, where my father was from Croatia and Italy. So my mother had another connection because the Celtic people come from, or pass by way of Northern Africa. Because they have the same, I guess what you say, genetic characteristics. And they all come from all of these Moorish, Berber people come from a blue race. We'll get to that later. So anyway, I was spending time, I had this experience in Scientology, which had led me right to Morocco, which was just kind of a stopping post for a few months of my life. And when we left Morocco, and when we left Morocco, it was very exciting. It was like the CIA was spreading all sorts of rumors, and we're trying to get Scientology out of Morocco because they didn't want Scientology to have, they hated Scientology. And the US government was always gunning for you. And then we had, the Mossad was very active in Moroccan politics. Morocco was a big ally of the Mossad, the Jewish intelligence force. And the Mossad and the CIA had trained Colonel Alfkur, who was doing all this miserable stuff to the king, who was able to live as a long time for the king of Morocco. Now, so I guess I was in Scientology for about 12 years, and in 1983 I left because the organization had been taken over by the government in a very systematic way. I've delineated in my book, Montauk Book of the Dead. And the Montauk Book of the Dead is a very interesting, it's kind of my life story, because I've written all these books, but I wrote the Montauk Book of the Dead because I didn't mean it to come out this way. And I will now go explain into the genesis of these. See, these two books were supposed to be one book. But if they were one book, this is kind of a thick book. You know, it's not good economically to produce it. Maybe it worked for you. But, you know, it would have taken me. It took me, like, I think 12 years to write this book. Okay? This one took about a year. But the reason it became two books, and I will go back into this whole Scientology experience. When I mentioned that I had left my body. And then when I got involved, and I never forgot that experience, and of course there were many subsequent experiences, but before I left Scientology, what I realized, if you spend so much time out of your body, you're not going to be here. You might forget to change the oil to your car. You might have a mishap. You might forget to brush your teeth and have teeth problems. I mean, if you're focusing not on the here and now. And because I'm a Capricorn, I said, I want to focus on the here and now. I want to pay attention to physical reality. And I left the Church of Scientology to go be a part of society. Because there's a tarot card called The World. And you can be cloistered in a religious environment. And there's a book by Herman Hesse called Magister Ludi, or the Glass Bead Game, which kind of gives the same syndrome. If you're in a secluded, cloistered, esoteric atmosphere, at some point you have to go out and face the world. Otherwise, you're just going to be a cloistered, you know, monk, nun, priest, you know what they get into. You're not functional in the world. So I said, I remember that tarot card, even though I didn't study the tarot, I said, it's time to go. And I left, got involved in the Montauk project, and then there was something very, very funny that happened as I began to study the Montauk project and the Philadelphia experiment. There were a couple of movies that came out about the Philadelphia experiment movie. And I was having dreams of an area in Southern California where my parents lived, in Ventura. And I began to have dreams of the highway, and they were exotic dreams. Now, the highway, it's just a highway, it's a pretty part. My dreams were exaggerating the beauty. So I kept having these dreams, and I thought it was connected to one of these movies in the Philadelphia experiment, Synchronicity, because it was taken in a town near there. So I attributed it to some weird synchronicity, but I began having the dreams, and I kept having the dreams, until finally, I went by that area in the physical universe on a vacation. And as I drove by, I'm mistelling the story. I have to digress or reinvent my story. I'm going to go back to this point. It's not going to have as much meaning. In the pursuit of these synchronicities, I discovered in a book called The History of Long Island, which became my book, The Pyramids of Montauk. And I'm going to pass around this book. It also appears in the Montauk, The Pyramids of Montauk. I discovered a book by Rufus Wilson. The name Wilson was appearing again. I opened the book and I saw this thing. It says, the pyramids, Montauk. Okay, I'm discovering there were pyramids in Montauk. I'm going to pass this around so you can all look at the pyramid. And so why are there pyramids in Montauk? There was no explanation in the book why there were pyramids in Montauk. Now, I've just been writing about a time travel research project there. So I asked the librarian, she took me to a room in the back, a research room, and she allowed me to look in books that were not open to the public, and she said, it said that the Montauk Air Force, where the Montauk Air Force Station is, known as Camp Hero, was once sacred Native American ground. And the family that ruled the Montauks were known as the Pharaohs. These are like the Pharaohs of Egypt. And I said, pharaohs and pyramids and Montauk, this is bizarre. So I had to write a whole book to explain what were these pyramids doing here? What were these, why was the people named pharaohs? Now the history books, which were written by white people, said that there were 13 tribes on Long Island and that the royal family were the pharaohs and they lived at Montauk. So Montauk was a royal spot. And I would later learn that Montauk meant the highest of the high, the highest expression of the divinity in their language. And I had some contact with the Montauk Indians, and the matriarch of the Montauk Indians was a woman named Olive Farrow. Now, Olive Farrow was a very nice lady. She had no knowledge of the Montauk Project or even the pyramids, but I had written the book. And after I wrote the book, she says, I want you to mention my son in the second printing, because you didn't mention him. I said, well, I didn't know you had a son. So I mentioned the book, and I sent it to her. And when she got the book, I called her up on the phone to see if she got the book, and she says, she didn't answer. Her sister answered and says, Olive just went to the hospital with a bleeding gallbladder. Olive would never live. She would be in the hospital for a few weeks and die. So then I went back to my research, and I said, oh my God. And I was studying these synchronicities I had with the olive, which I will go into in a little more depth, and it said the olive would be used in the future to heal the gallbladder. And she just died of one. But I had already been on a trail of olives, and I said, oh my God, her name's Olive, and she's sacred to the pharaohs. But I was put on to the olive by a mysterious friend of mine who showed up at a lecture he was giving one day, and he brought me this picture. He brought me a playbill from 1909 it was called the New Montauk Theater. It was just an ordinary playbill from a long time ago. And I said, why are you giving me this? He says, it's for you. I just saw it, and I knew I knew it was meant for you. And I'm going to show you a picture of it here. It says, The Follies of 1909, the Montauk Theater. And I looked at this thing, and because I was very much pursuing occult clues, I couldn't find any clues in it. I studied it for a while, gave it up, and after about a year, I had a man at my house from England, and we were talking about things, and I had Duncan Cameron in my house. He was the psychic in the Montauk Project. I suddenly remembered this playbill, and I said, well, maybe Duncan could give me a psychic read on it, because he's a Cameron. And so I went down, and I'd been sitting on a bottom of papers on my desk upstairs, so I brought it downstairs and I said, Duncan, here, let me give this to you. And as I gave it to him, the back of the cardboard in the back began to fall off. And I said, there's something underneath. And I pulled it open, and there was a picture of Christ on Mount Olive. And I said, oh my God, what is this? Why is this appearing right here? And Christ on Mount Olive. And it told me that I needed to study what is the Mount of Olives. So I called up my friend who gave it to me, and I said, what is this about? He says, well, you would have discovered this sooner or later. He says that the olives are sacred to the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar revere the feminine energy. so he says, but see what an olive tree looks like. So I went on a quest to find an olive tree, which I'd never seen in person. And it took me a few months to find one in a library book, because we didn't have the internet in those days. So basically said an olive tree was a connection to the inner earth. They live 800 years. But then I began to study the olive and find out that the olive was sacred to the Christians. They use it for chrism. It was sacred to Muslims, and it was sacred to Jews, who used the oil to light the menorah for 8 days in the temple. And it was also sacred to the Greeks. The Greeks had a contest to see who could give the greatest gift to mankind, and the winner was Athena. She gave mankind the olive. And the loser was Poseidon, who gave mankind the horse, which is the symbol on the Montauk Project, which is a male patriarchal symbol. They revered Athena. So she gave mankind the olive, or the olive tree. They had one on Mount Olympus. Athens was named after Athena. And I was very much into this pursuit of olives. There are many synchronicities I had with olives. It's sacred. And then I discovered through a friend of mine, Mark Roberts, that when he had studied my work, and he says, well, this olive, he says, he sent me some materials from a dowser called Egerton Sykes, who used to write journals on Atlantis. And his work showed that Athena was a name derived from an earlier African queen named Antonia. And this is Antonia, whose name was transliterated into Athena. And Antonia was a blue goddess from Atlantis. And her people migrated at the end of Atlantis. There was, I guess, priestesses, there were scribes, and the scribes went to Ireland, became the Tuatha De Danann. That's sort of where my mother's family kind of descends from. And the temple priestesses and the warriors went away. Some say they went and became the Vikings. And because there was no temple to guard anymore when Atlantis fell. And the priestesses migrated into Africa, into what is now the Sahara. It was the Triton Sea. It was a beautiful sort of Garden of Eden. And they had a blue queen, okay, a blue queen. And one of my Moorish friends told me the olives symbolize all colors. Because olives come in all colors. They don't come in just black or green. And he said that olive was symbolic of all races. And of course this blue race, which I also wrote in The Black Sun, is indicative of what's called an Rh negative blood type. The blue people, and this book goes into it in quite a bit of detail, how they legendarily descend from Mars. The word Cairo comes from Alcahyro, which means Mars. And this book also explains how, see, there's this occult, as I mentioned, occult synchronicities, and there is an infamous occultist named Aleister Crowley who was featuring a lot of these things, and he channeled a book. He channeled a book called the Book of the Law, which he channeled after going into the pyramid at Cairo. A lot of strange circumstances around it, but the information he channeled in that book was decoded by a friend of mine who's an occultist, where it shows the interrelationship of 5 and 6, okay? But you have to be able to read the code. There's whole secret societies based upon this magician that don't know what they're talking about. They're going off and spinning dark magic and doing irresponsible things and giggling about it. But they didn't know this code that this gentleman I happen to know decoded. And it's all about codes of 5 and 6. And this ties into Cairo because what he said is, it shows the pentagram, which is a 5, and that hexagram, which is a 6. And when you juxtapose them one on top of the other, it's like a male and a female going together. But it also is the structure for the Kabbalistic tree of life, which you probably all seen. Now when you twist this, it becomes a DNA spiral. It's explained exactly in the book. book. So in other words, this channeled information through Aleister Crowley, who was a very, what you call, double-agent, double-sided character himself. He was channeling the structure of DNA, if you were so gifted as to be able to interpret it, which he never did interpret. I didn't interpret it. I had a friend who had a gift for this, who had very strange experiences in his own right. But anyway, 5-6 is key when we consider Cairo, because I found on another website where it explains what's called the 156 ratio, where the capstone of the Great Pyramid is 1/56 the size of the Great Pyramid itself. The capstone is 1/56 size. The capstone is missing. It represents the missing key to consciousness on this planet.
5-6?
I said it's 1/56 the size of the Great Pyramid, the capstone. 150. In other words, if you took this area of the capstone, it would be 1/56 the size of the Great Pyramid itself. The Giza, the Great Pyramid is 1/56 size of the Giza Plateau, which is in turn 1/56 size of the continent of Africa, which is in turn 1/56 the size of the planet Earth. So you see, whoever built this pyramid knew this 5-6 ratio, which was symbolic of this DNA spiral. In other words, they knew they were life. This is a manifestation of a divine inspiration, a divine consciousness that was manifesting itself through this dark magician who was bisexual and a lot more. He called himself the Antichrist, so he was a very dubious character in himself. But he was in the Great Pyramid and spent the night in there with his wife prior to having these revelations come, which actually came through his wife at first. They came to her initially, and she was not a medium or anything like that, but she kind of got in the mood of the pyramid. So that what this is really saying is that whoever built that Great Pyramid, it's like a memory storage. And Egypt, of course, I would find out, was called the land of the olives. Isis was the queen of the olives. Isis is also portrayed as blue. So it's not really a stretch when you look at all the data to think that it might have been off-planet fertilization from a colony, because according to tradition, Mars had to come here when they began to have their own problems on that planet. And of course, the Rh negative, Rh means rhesus factor, monkey blood. So most people in the world have Rh positive. Most of us have a kinship with the monkeys. I don't even know what my blood type is, so it doesn't matter. If you're Rh negative, you don't have that factor. It means, and of course, all the races can have Rh negative. It can be black, yellow, red, blue, whatever. It doesn't really matter. And of course, I first kind of got interested in this when I had a friend who was black, and he told me that, he'd been over to West Africa where he had an uncle or something, and he said the people would turn purple. They get so much sun, they would actually turn purple when the sun would come out. So you have black people being purple or blue. You have white people, the Celtic people believe they were blue. Tibetans have blue gods. It's a priori function or manifestation. And it goes very deep. It goes very deep because it's embedded in our culture in many respects. The Queen Antonia